All right, welcome to the structural modeling video conference for November 2nd, 2019. We have a presentation again, pattern literacy in the context of structural modeling. So Helene, I'll pass it over to you and let you take it away.
Okay. So I'll start with connecting patterns and systems. Systems have often been described in relation to patterns and cognition. So I have two quotations here, one by Donella Meadows and another one by Mobus and Carlton in their systems, I think, principles book. And in the context of the pattern literacy and systems literacy group at the Bertalanffy Center, we did a survey on what people understood as patterns and how it connected to systems. And I compiled a definition of pattern in relation to system as an arrangement of elements repeated or repeatable in space and time that is cognized or recognized as a manifestation of reality, whatever this may mean to different people, or of a system at work that helps inquiry, meaning making, design, and the understanding and orientation of systems, structure, behavior, and transformation. So patterns are quite interesting because they have three aspects to them. They connect three different realms. You find them in objects that are phenomenologically experienced, events or the system at work, actually. In the interpretation we make of it, that is cognitively processed. So our interpretation and mental models, as well as the signs that we culturally recognize or produce that describe these or express these experienced objects. And so the pattern in its different forms can function as a mediator or connector between these three different realms, the world of what our attention is directed to and our thought, as well as their representation and interpretation. And there's a constant decoding and encoding of this experience, which, by the way, Rosen has also documented in his modeling relation, using different types of formalizations and languages. And patterns can help connect multiple levels of granularity or different elements that may seem incommensurable or not connectable at first sight. So they act as potentially structured, scientifically. One can say that pattern is the first cross-cutting concept of science. It's the element observed. It's cognitively, culturally, socially recognizable unit of meaning. So they can connect things across boundaries, such as different aspects and levels of systems or dimensions of complexity, different perspectives and representations, and cybernetic feedbacks that result from both observation and practice. So we can use them to unpack and connect these various aspects, levels, and dimensions. This has been illustrated by SOA, the role of patterns in the cognitive cycle. All these activities of as units of meaning and cognitive processing that are key in inquiry and learning. And another way of illustrating that is the Boyd's OODA loop, where patterns are at play in the orientation phase, and lots of different types of patterns come into play to actually motivate the decision or trigger a decision and an action. I pass quickly on that. So we introduced pattern literacy at the ISSS 2017 conference with Peter. Peter was working on systems literacy. There had been a meeting of the IFSR in Linz focused on systems literacy, and they came up with the part in, do I have my, yeah, the part in black here, that systems literacy that underpinned systems capability and all the different roles and types of systemic work, let's say, or functions, and that this systems literacy was underpinned itself by a systemic sensibility. And I came in there saying, well, maybe, but maybe we can take one step beyond that into pattern literacy and go back to the innate pattern or patterning instinct of humans to discover, recognize, associate, generate, monitor, mobilize patterns in order to make sense of and design or influence the systems around them. So the interesting thing is that, and sorry, I'm getting a bit out of breath when I talk, literacy is defined in a UNESCO position paper about several years ago as the ability to identify, understand, interpret, create, communicate, and compute. So in this particular case, it's using printed and written materials associated with varying contexts, but we can extend that to different forms of signs or different forms of languages. And it involves a continuum of learning and enabling individuals to achieve goals, develop knowledge and potential, and to participate in their community and wider society. So it's not just about capturing patterns and freezing them and putting them on a shelf or in a database. It's being able to actively and interact with patterns on an ongoing way, so as to also see how these patterns evolve and change. Oops. So now what? How does this help modeling, in particular across all types of boundaries, in the context of the difficulty to integrate complexity into graspable wholes? Because we have an intrication of the problem field, while knowledge and the solution field are fragmented increasingly, and nobody has an overall view of the whole thing. We were talking, Joe, about the difficulty or the question of how can we compute ourselves into wholeness and coherence. And I'm adding in here, how can we talk each other into alignment and shared meaning, both on a, let's say, punctual or momentous way when people gather for a specific occasion, or on an ongoing manner. And so I've been investigating the limits of language, and we could say languages, as coordination tools for addressing complexity and knowledge fragmentation. And I'm making a distinction between patterning and languaging. So what what happens when we try and work across disciplines and domains. We try to use language to find shared references, values, vision, discourse, but it's not as effective as expected. Why? So everybody has an illustration or another of the blind man and the elephant fable, and how can we get the whole elephant into the picture while keeping our operational focus and not getting diluted in something that takes our attention away from our current and everyday activity. Differences are broader than we realize. We all have different opinions about the same things. Same words can mean different things. And if you look at this blue and yellow illustration here that I took from Pilar Bunel's presentation at ISSS, she's crossing the semantic fields of words in English and in Estonian, and you can see that there's no one-to-one equivalence between words or symbols across domains. So I'll plunge a little bit into semiosis in order to understand the why of all this. Domain science systems are constructed via semiosis, and it's not just human culture and human domains. It goes back to species evolution. If you look at it from a biosemiotic perspective, an evolutionary perspective, semiosis encompasses the processes which involve signs as mediators that ensure optimal performance of organisms via interactions with cues or signs that are present in dynamic situations. And this is what I call patterning, is the capacity to act given the signs that are available to us. This works for any living system. Semiosis mediates matter and energy exchanges in living systems through the sensory motor processes and coordinates and orients behavior. And that's key to any socio-technological system, which is not necessarily even the systems that we build, because we have humans that interact with these systems and that transform what the system may do, or the outputs or the outcomes generated by a system. So signals are possibilities for interpretation actualized into responses, which become signs for next interpretation. So there's a recursive cybernetic process. And so this means that a decision somewhere can actually get a system to change. So it's not a big system that once it's done continues to perform and produce the outcomes that are expected. So cumulative experience generates habits, making same or next signals anticipable. And so it enhances learning and fosters the emergence of new capabilities within existing boundaries. So generating habits is a good thing because we acquire automatisms. That's what training is all about. But it channels and formats behavior. So there's a dichotomy with patterns that's due to the plasticity of patterns, is that it can become super rigid and lock into some specific behavior or outcomes. But it is also, the pattern is also as unit of meaning or cognitive process, it's also very flexible and can be assembled on the fly. So that's important to know how to play on both and how to use both qualities, let's say, or characteristics of patterns. But it is the congruence of these habits among structurally coupled organisms, meaning that organisms that co-evolve and co-adapt, that creates the semiotic niches, so the shared, what Maturana called consensual cognitive domains, where things are done, let's say, in similar ways. And these co-adaptations are eventually genetically integrated when we look at this from an evolutionary perspectives. So as I already said, it's key to know because the systems that we build involve humans and human decision and action, individual and collective. And the interest of pattern literacy is that it brings patterns to consciousness and it helps mitigate these frozen or flexibility aspects. I'm just doing a little incursion into evolution here. There's a biosemiotician, a biologist, or was it a ethologist, like animal anthropologist, who considered semiosis as generating the capacity for a species to produce and comprehend the specific types of models it requires for processing and codifying perceptual input in its own way. So the way we conceive, the way we decode and encode models are actually dependent on the sign systems that are generated through our co-evolution in social groups, let's say. So it's not only at the human level, it started, so there's this biosemiotician Hofmeier who has shown that the whole evolution, and in the evolution of species, there's a complexification of semiotic capacity that because within each niche, the limits are pushed and new competencies are acquired and become habits that are then inscribed in genes. And human language is one of them, or so this is another way of representing it. So within each semiotic niche, there's an increased cognitive and semiotic competence. So that's a biology, which enhances sign systems, the culture, and enable more complex social interactions. And it generates out of equilibrium conditions with new evolutionary pressures that lead to further cognitive improvements at each generation and further recursions. So it is believed that language, human language, emerged in two steps. One was 1 million years ago, and another one closer to 100 or 60,000 years ago. And this approach biosemiotic approach allows a bioconstructivist perspective that links nature and culture in a continuum of nested and forked micro and macro evolutions. So the two steps, and we'll see how it's important to us now, is that the first step is the emergence of a symbolic system which compressed signals and shifted from pragmatic inferential reference system, which is directly inferable because totally close to the experience, to a symbolic reference. And that was caused by a pressure brought about by the need to be able to account for past events and future possibilities and longer thoughts and greater volumes of information. And the second step came by a need to be able to argument and verify what was articulated in a way to better and to optimize the spatio-temporal mapping of what was said. And this is syntax, how syntax emerged as and language as we know it. So there's been a lot of focus on syntax when we talk about language, but the key point that is a problem for us is the symbolic sign system, because we moved from indexical references which are directly pointing to something that can point to, if you take the example of a buffalo, if you look at buffalo tracks, well, here was the buffalo. And you can also have what we call iconic reference, which is by mimicry or analogy, that referring to the actual object or event. But when we started to evoke a buffalo in written or spoken terms, then it's a whole other dimension we're in. And we shift from something that is denotative, pointing to figurative, analogical, to something totally connotative that doesn't bear any clue of what we're talking about in itself. It needs a contextual reference that is pre-known, but which does not come necessarily in the context where we are using the actual language. So it freed from the here and now, and it allowed multiple recursions, bringing freedom to the thought process and enabled us humans to build huge conceptual constructions. But this was detached from a perceptual groundedness of language as an orientational activity in what Maturana would call a consensual domain of interlocked conduct, detached from direct shared experience. So if you consider a cognitive domain, do you have any questions? Sorry, I'm talking. Or do you want me to continue and ask the questions in the end?
Well, let's see. Are there any questions so far?
Okay. So if you consider cognitive domain as a domain of shared experience and cooperation, and consensual as something that's felt and sensed together, not necessarily consciously and intentionally, the symbolic system's form is socially acquired within a consensual cognitive domain in a given semiotic niche, and its grounding into perceptual reality is externalized in a collective memory and is tacitly understood and reproduced through a history of personal and social experience. And the tacit grounding that enables this detachment happens during child development via successive construction and learning of the child, which first has a totally indexical and iconic reference system. They recognize the face of the mother, then they recognize what is pointed to, and then they construct more complex concepts and acquire the symbolic references. So interpretation there is supported by an ongoing familiarity with symbolic semiotic relations that are reinforced through learning and recursively shaped by and shaping the frames through which we interpret, construct our consensual cognitive domains and de facto the ways in which we interpret and construct our modeling systems. So languaging and using languages, whether using language, and I have to go back to Maturana, because what is called languaging is using language to focus on language as object of coordination. So it's a kind of derivative of language. And so you can use common language and discuss common formulations within consensual cognitive domain. It works because there is this familiarity already with the domain we are talking about. And in many occasions, even if there's not a direct connection, well, let's say that within an organization, there's an organizational culture, even if people have never met and ways of doing things around here. In an industry, there's also some points that can connect, but sometimes there aren't any domains of historically shared ways of doing things. And so using language does not necessarily work. This does not work across identity, experience, and knowledge domains systematically. It does not work systematically across different cognitive frames and language systems. And the major error that is made is to view languages as representational and denotative, so pointing to an external world or experience that everybody can refer to. But outside of shared experience context, so cultural context, in the long term, there's no shared perceptual reality or experience and no tacit grounding of the language to support from historic shared experience. And there's no ground for the translation or recursive habit that helps reflect, integrate, and change. So languaging is not effective as a factor of coherence that can transcend cultural and domain context. Bringing people to talk things through may provide some valuable input, but will not in itself create a new culture that sticks. So there is a need, and I'm saying tongue-in-cheek a bit, is it an evolutionary pressure for some reciprocal grounding processes across symbolic systems using humans' advanced semiotic competence, processes and relations, so patterning, in order to coalesce different forms of agencies and knowledges. So to me, how do you access this patterning competence, semiotic competence, processes and relation is the key thing to the key nut to crack. So I have proposed some ways forward, and it's a bit packed in the PowerPoint presentation. I was bringing them up one by one. But the first is to distinguish the patterning, which is totally cognitive, in action, like embodied cognition, and the languaging, which is the derivative is, which is language talking about the coordination aspects of things, and develop frameworks that deal with intersubjective boundaries, and to know that you can use language to a certain extent within subjective worlds, or coherent or cohesive domains, but you need to use patterning more across intersubjective worlds, and to co-discover unknowns or blind spots across these different worlds, to be able to get the elephant, the whole elephant, to emerge. So this would imply to work deeper directly at the semiotic process level, to study sign processes and relationships, and the formation of reference systems and patterns, to crack the symbolic, to go back to more directly embodied and direct experience, so people can understand each other in better ways. So reconstruct the sign relations and grounding at the foundation of symbolic representation, and develop this pattern literacy based on these patterning processes and different ways of modeling. How do people model things? I didn't show up the experiment that Peter Tottenham did at ISSS 2016, when he had people in a room in the keynote amphitheater to design an image of what they thought a system was, and there was no two representations that were similar out of, I don't know, dozens of them. We could sort them into categories, but there was always a category missing. And so even in the modeling, and this is something that you have and structural modeling has been pointing to, there are different ways of doing things, of modeling things. So how can we try and connect these different ways of modeling and find bridges between them? So one possibility is use patterns as boundary objects and patterning methods to confront and relate ways of knowing, perceiving, evoking, representing, interpreting different or shared perceptual realities, and build the tools that can capture this and provide maps and graphs or semiotic networks that can allow navigation within this different ways, so that people can actually understand the relative positions in action and cognitive spaces. So just to conclude, an idea that I have been working on and discussing with several people, including Len Troncale, was ways to interconnect different patterns on all types of criteria, not necessarily isomorphy. That's why I wrote other morphic, other types of morphism, patterns of different nature, so that we could navigate these networks or clusters of linked data in order to support conversations and eventually have consensual patterns or languages that emerge. So here I am, a little bit longer than the 20 minutes I had anticipated, but now we can discuss.
Well, thank you very much, Helene. This has been very interesting. And I think there's a lot of a similarity, lots of points of similarity between what I've heard you say here and the structural modeling work. Just to highlight a few, not dominate the time here, give other people time to talk. But the idea of the language, of sorting out languages, is the idea of a meta language and the object language. So you use the meta language to talk about the object language. And so that's a way that you can, what you were talking about, your languaging thing, you can make a clear distinction about, oh, this is what we're doing is we're actually talking about how we can change this language so that we all understand what it means. And another thing is the recursive patterning integration piece. It's the idea of the polyloop model. It's not necessarily your graphics, but what I heard you say reminded me very much of the polyloop model.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, on your last slide here, I'll just make a reference to a knowledge representation practitioner by Michael K. Bergman, guidelines based on Charles Sanders Peirce, which talks about how you can leverage the Knowledgepedia, Wikipedia, Datapedia, all these huge data sources that are on the web through this logic framework. So with that, I'll see if there's any other question.
I just have one comment before.
Sure.
About meta language, because
Yeah.
meta is also language about language.
Mm-hmm.
And the focus on patterning is to say, well, maybe it's more basic, maybe it's more, I don't know if what the contrary, if the meta is transcending and up there, what's down there? It's like grounded language.
Sure. So
this is what I'd like to throw in there, because we hear of meta and
Mm-hmm.
more and more abstraction. And I'm kind of saying, how can we go back to more and more groundedness to go back to the abstraction? So, yeah.
Well, that's a good point. And I think basically the idea is, within Warfield's view of these two approaches, is that the meta language was natural language,
Okay.
and then the object language is mathematics, a formal language. So you have two completely different categories of language. One is very formal mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
It's computable, executable. It has all those characteristics. Then you have natural language, which has also very desirable types of adaptive, direct connection to context type of attributes. So but just in making the distinction, then you're saying, okay, how can we relate these two completely different kinds of language?
Yeah.
So, Helene, I get the impression, this is Janet.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I get the impression that you are, and sorry if I just missed part of that interchange, but from your last talk and as well, that you are seeking something that transcends language. I feel like you're a bit, it's a bit of a Kleinbottle kind of situation where you want to find language that transcends language. You want to find a way of expressing things in terms of patterns, which you will be expressing in language, but you want it to
not
transcend
necessarily
language.
in language. That's the thing, or expressing it in language, but in different way. It's not transcendence. Is how do you find the building blocks? How do you find this way of experiencing in a more embodied, like sensorial types of way, and how do you share on this? So maybe it's using language with some protocols of use of language that does not just spin on itself to say, what word can we use that we'll all agree upon, which is a transcendental thing, but rather, what do we really mean by this?
Right.
Before trying to define the language, rather say, well, in my language or in this language, this means that, and it's similar to what you mean.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I appreciate that. I guess I feel like whichever way you approach this, I think you're going to come up against age-old paradoxes,
Yeah.
because the work that Warfield was doing and the work that Kevin and Joe and Mary have been doing is all about exactly what you're talking about. It's how do you find ways of supporting people to come to group understanding, and it has to be more than one-on-one. One of the resolutions of your problem is to say, well, people should just communicate face to face, because then they have the best chance of having an embodied sensorial mutual understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, you want to develop some technology that
Mm-hmm.
will accelerate and support achieving that kind of mutual understanding. And once you develop some structures to support them, then there's a possibility that those will interfere or at least not achieve the ends that you want. So there's a paradox of
Mm-hmm.
a number of traditions, the Hasidic Judaism, and I don't know if we've talked about this before, but they would forbid writing things down because they would want the only face-to-face communication. They wouldn't want the form of the language to substitute for the content.
Yeah, it's the
But
whole argument of sophists.
right. So,
But
but on the other hand, at some point there's a pragmatic recognition that pursuing, that you can't just rely on face-to-face communication. That we're hoping to find ways to accelerate
mm-hmm.
coming to understanding. And how do you do that? You need technology, not just. You need some kind of technology, conceptual technology, computer technology.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what kind of technology are you? So I feel like you're framing a problem, but what,
Well,
other than people listening to you talk about patterns, which requires, it's a one-to-one commitment of time, and they may or may not understand what you're talking about. Do you have ideas in mind for tools?
well, yes, I was talking about building, and I think what you described in one of the talks as, semantic networks and knowledge graphs, it's something that I've been talking about also, about trying to get people to work face to face, and that's probably what structural modeling and Warfield's work and Joe's and yours and many people's work is tending to. What I'm trying to build is some let's say theory behind it to say, well, be careful, it's not just about agreeing on more words or agreeing on ontologies. It's deeper than that. And the patterning is something that runs deep into our DNA. So how can we capture that? I don't have the responses yet. That's why I'm kind of going a bit in circles in the trying to find elements to support what I'm trying to say. But if you look at the ways forward, the directions for future work, the work of reconstructing sign relations and grounding at the foundation of symbolic representations. Well, this is some practical things that can be done with some tools there. Then having techniques that use patterns as boundary objects, if you and confront ways and relate ways of knowing, perceiving, evoking, representing, you can create knowledge networks that capture this. So of course it's biased when it's captured, and I'm totally conscious that even the fact of, I'm saying the pattern is out there, the pattern is in our minds, and the pattern is represented. Well, you can only have representations and external expressions. So we de facto bring ourselves to one side of the triangle, because there's no way to get or to represent or to summon the other two sides. But if you confront your ways of interpreting and representing, and you create some form of navigation maps, it can help understand where people are located in an action or in a cognitive space or in an opinion space. I mean, there are things to do, and I've written about that at some times.
But don't you think that the semiosis is always dialectical? It always involves. It's not a matter of being on one side, because it always involves all of that. The problem
of course it does. It does. Of course, yeah. That's what I'm trying to show. So right. You can't resolve it by you can't resolve the issues by saying that, well, it's just by tweaking the meta language, or it's just by finding shared values, or just by finding a shared language. It's not just that. Of course, it goes through this, because that's our mode of expression. But you right. can do it in a way that takes the patterning aspects into account, and get more grounded as you. So what I'm providing is maybe I don't know, a framework, so that the tools. I'm not a tool maker, so I'm trying to give hints so that the tools that I'd like be built.
Right. Well, you can think of it as conceptual tools.
Yes.
If you can get the conceptual tool structure clear,
well, that's what I'm trying to do.
Can implement it.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid that there are these paradoxes. I think, for example, in Joe and Mary's work, building on Warfield, you have what people have found that are the fundamental building blocks are logic, math, or attempts to catalog entities in ontologies. These are all limited in some way, but these are the recurrent patterns that facilitate cross situation, cross person communication, and then as Joe emphasizes, in context. The context provides the content provides the customization and the embodiment.
But what I'm also saying in this presentation is that it's not just that you need to create a moment context where people share something, is that there's a whole historical and cultural context that provides things. So sometimes it's elusive to say that things are going to be solved in a 1 shot, or in a 3 shot, or in a 10 shot, getting people together face to face. It's something that needs to be built in a way of inquiry, a way of learning, a way of getting back to the patterns that are closer to the way we sense things and we deal with experience, and we can get to our sensitivity to kind of sense the systems or make sense of things. So, I'm in the middle, or I'm in the first phase of my research on this. So I probably haven't formulated it, although I think I'm getting clearer and clearer, but I haven't formulated it in a finished way yet. But that's where I'm trying to do, is to have the conceptual tool so that people can build actual tools.
Well, these are very interesting points, and I think that there's on one hand, I know in the interpretive structural modeling world, there was the idea that Warfield had, we'd have an event, right? And this would have because these things cost so much at that time, that they would just specify a specific event. Then as they developed it a little bit, then the people in Mexico, and I think the people also in Cyprus, had got to the point where, well, no, we really want to have a capability. We want to build a structured environment that allows us to have these almost continuous types of events as needed. So we have a continuum. We create a place. We create a physical space. So we start to now changing our context and our environment and our tool set. And I know Kevin has been worked with this specifically, but these types of things I think are slowly developing, and the tools are becoming available. And as I was mentioning to Helene earlier on, Michael K. Bergman has written a book on knowledge representation practitionary guidelines based on Charles Sanders Peirce, has opened, backed by a knowledge representation, an open source KBpedia, which indexes a vast amount of open source material on the web. And so these, I think, are the types of developments that are going to be able to support the types of tooling that would be available. On one hand, you have the social organization and the processes that were developed starting with Warfield and then through the other people that have worked on this. And then simultaneously, you have tool bases that are coming out of computer science and coming out of semantic web. And so I think the integration of those, there may be some ways that would be very valuable.
So what usefulness do you find in making this distinction between the languaging and the patterning, or focusing on the actual?
Oh, well, there's one of the primary things, especially in large multi-group or multi-company type of or international types. Let's say take an international supply chain, and you have people of different languages, different native languages. They have different views of process. They have different views of culture and what's proper to how to integrate with each other. So those types of interactions can greatly benefit from these types of tools that were developed in the structural modeling and the ISM, and also the techniques that they have with SDD and so forth. So those, I think, are very important, because it gives people a structured way to come together face to face and to effectively address the issues that they have, which is, we have different languages, we have different concepts. We have to work together, so let's sit down and at a minimum come up with a working vocabulary that we can, build on as we go.
Another issue, I think, getting to the dialectical character of semiosis, is that when you talk about patterns and patterning, I think you need to be very careful. And I didn't listen to everything with this in mind, so I don't know if you did this, but even pattern literacy, the phrase, patterns as opposed to patterning. The operational patterning, you can say, is clearly a deep, process that is at the root of language, that's beyond language. Patterns are, the artifacts, the residue, the things.
Mhm.
They're not the patterning, and the patterns. So to some extent, the the idea that there are patterns sort of interferes with the patterning.
Well,
Or
if I define patterns as signs within the semiotic process that have an artifact form, but also have a sign form and an interpreter form, then the pattern is a part, is a unit of patterning in a
but
way.
that's only to an interpreter evaluator who understands that sign. So that's only, otherwise it's just another artifact. So what transforms it to, what connects it to the living operational patterning process is beyond something that is in the sign itself.
Well, it's the
Um,
semiosis, it's the semiotic process.
right, but that's what you don't have control over. That gets at the whole question of the community of practice. The person has to be in the community of practice that is, and they have to be disposed with the capability and the interest and the the sensitivity to understand a particular sign. The one phrase, I think I might have mentioned this to you, that I heard an anthropologist say a long time ago was, knowledge transmitted reverts to signal. And so it's, when we call it a sign, we're also sort of, that's a bit of projection, that we are assuming it can function as a sign. It's a signal unless there's a receiver disposed to interpret it.
Yes.
But it's the whole, I mean, the whole Peircean semiosis and biosemiotics is about the sign that is at the same time the object, the interpreter, and the signal. So for me, it's like almost like a place hanger. It's like I'm using this in order to bring together the different aspects of what I'm talking about.
Well,
In
that's
order
that's very good, Helene. I think we got about 2 minutes left now,
yeah.
and we have Kevin is going to be continuing his discussion on the history of ISM on the 16th. Is that right, Kevin?
Yes, I think I'll try to segue from some of the points that were raised in this presentation.
Okay.
Oh,
Excellent.
you don't want to? Sorry, are you going to say something about it, Kevin, or not? I didn't quite get what you just said.
Oh, that the presentation 2 weeks from now.
Oh, okay.
Connects with one I did a month ago, and I had previously presented, and they're about underlying presumptions or philosophies of structural modeling. And I think with respect to your presentation, there's some kind of fundamental ideas that we can bring out that connect with what you were
Okay.
talking about. So, for example, there's an underlying presumption in structural modeling called the lumped parameter assumption, right? So you're familiar with this already because you've seen diagrams of arrows and nodes, arrows and dots and arrows between dots.
Mm-hmm.
And that's presuming that the things of interest are on the dots. and the relationship between the dots, and that whatever is described by the dots, in your case, language or what something means or a sign, that it's not bleeding across all the other arrows and dots.
Mm-hmm.
And so a practical aspect of that when you're doing structural modeling is that someone makes a statement which is going to become a dot, except wrapped in a statement might be a dozen or 20 words that have a lot of meanings and internal structure and patterns.
Yeah.
But we treat them as a single dot, as a lumped parameter.
Okay.
And that's how we do systems dynamics, for example. It's a lumped parameter model.
Okay.
All right.
Right?
That's really good. I'll look forward to that discussion in a couple weeks.
Right.
And we're now at the end of our hour. And thank you very much, Helene. This has been very interesting. I think there's a lot of connections here. And again, I'll put in another plug for this Knowledge Representation Practitioner book. I think it has a lot of, would be of interest to people that attended today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Helene. Bye-bye.